Hello class. Today we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing integers. But first, let's kind of go back and review what we had to do with addition. We learned yesterday when we were talking about addition that there's two basic rules for addition and subtraction. If you are adding, and you know it's an addition problem because there was a plus in the middle. If your signs are alike, you add your numbers and keep the sign of the problem. If your signs are different, you would subtract your numbers and take the sign of the number with the largest absolute value. Now, if it's a subtraction problem, we learned that we just don't do it. We change it. And what do we do with subtraction? And we know it's subtraction because there's a minus in the middle. We change the subtraction sign to an addition sign, and the next number to its opposite, and then we go back to our addition rules. Well, today what I want us to look at is multiplication. And what we're going to do is we're going to summarize what we did in a chart real quick. So we're going to create a little chart that looks something like this. And the chart's going to say signs on the problem. And this other side's going to say operation. Okay, so we're going to summarize the addition and subtraction rules in a chart. So if I had a problem that had a positive number and a positive number, and I'm going to add those together, what operation would we do to put those together? We would add our numbers together. Kind of like what the rule just said, that if our signs are alike, we add and keep the sign. Well, what if one of them was positive and one of them was negative? Well, if our signs are different and it's an addition problem, we're going to subtract our numbers. Well, what if the first one was negative and the second one was positive? Well, again, our signs are different, so that means we're going to subtract our numbers. What if the first one was negative and the second one was negative? Well, if our signs are alike, then we're going to add the numbers together and keep the sign of the problem. So that's what our addition rule said. Now we're going to come back and revisit this in just a few minutes when we're dealing with multiply and divide. So let's look at multiplication. In this particular problem, I'm asking you, what does 2 times 3 really mean? And what it really means is I've got two groups of 3. Okay? Now, we've also got to now start thinking about what kind of a group is there? What kind of a number is this? It's a positive 3. So we need two groups of positive 3. Well, there's one group. There's the second group. So what kind of an answer do we have? Positive 6. So a positive times a positive gives us a positive. Well, that's kind of like what we've always known. Okay? Well, what if I had 2 times negative 3? Well, in the first problem, this 2 said two groups of positive 3. Now it says I need two groups of negative 3. So what would that look like? Well, that would look like two groups of negative 3. So what kind of an answer would I get? Negative 6. So here's a positive times a negative gives me a negative as an answer. Well, what if I had negative 2 times positive 3? Well, if we continue keeping this as our group, what this really says is I've got the opposite of, that's what that negative in front of the 2 says. I want the opposite of two groups of positive 3. And the opposite of two groups of positive 3 would be two groups of negative 3. Okay, so again, we would end up with a negative 6 as an answer. So a negative times a positive gives me a negative as an answer. Well, what if I had a negative times a negative? Well, what this one says is I want the opposite of two groups of negative 3, which is two groups of positive 3, which gives me an answer of positive 6. So a negative times a negative is a positive. So if we were to look at this in terms of a chart, what we found out is that if I had in this chart signs on problem again, this time for multiply and divide, this one's going to say sign on answer. So if I had a positive times a positive, what kind of an answer did I get? Well, I ended up with a positive answer, as you can tell. Positive times a positive gave me a positive. Well, what if I had a positive times a negative? Well, if I had a positive times a negative, that gave me a negative as an answer. Well, what if I had a negative times a positive? Well, that one gave me a negative as an answer. And what if I had a negative times a negative? Well, that gave me a positive as an answer. So if you look at these charts, the only difference is between this chart and the other chart is the words right up here on this column. Because in addition, this one said operation, and in multiplication it says sign on the answer. So let's see if we can do a couple questions here real quick, just to make sure that we understand what we're doing. Okay, so before we do that though, let's talk about the rules then. So in essence, for multiply, what I need you to do is, step number one, multiply your numbers together. You multiply your numbers, and then we say, if our signs are alike, our answer is positive. If our signs are different, our answer is negative. Okay, so if I gave you a question like the first one, 4 times negative 6, we would first multiply. 4 times 6 is 24. I've got one negative there. It's a positive times a negative, so it gives me a negative as an answer. But what if I have multiple numbers? Well, if I have multiple numbers, if you have more than 2 numbers, then step number one is you multiply your numbers together. Step number 2 then is you count your negative signs. Count your negative signs. If you have an even number of negative signs, they all pair up, and they'll become a positive answer. If you have an odd number, you're going to have one that's left out, and it's going to give you a negative as an answer. So if I did this second question then, step number 1 is multiply the numbers together. 3 times 6 is 18, times 2 is 36. But how many negatives do you see? Well, these two will go together to make a positive. But now I have a positive times a negative, which gives me a negative as an answer. So if I count my negatives, 1, 2, 3, 3 negatives, that makes a negative because it's odd. Well, what if I have these 4 numbers here? Well, we multiply. 5 times 3 is 15, times 2 is 30, times 1 is 30. So how many negatives do you see? Well, let's see, 1 negative here and 1 negative there, so that makes it a positive 30. Now, you'll ask, well, what about the 5 and the 2? We don't worry about the 5 and the 2 because they're already positive. Okay, only worry about negatives. So we count the negatives. So if I've got 2 negatives, my answer is positive. If I've got 3 negatives, my answer is negative. And now we have this last question. The last question says, negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1. Some people say I should be an auctioneer, but I'm not. So we multiply the problem. We got to have all those ones. Well, all those ones are going to give me 1. And now we count the negatives. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives. So the 6 negatives make this a positive 1. And that's how you multiply integers. Now some will ask then, okay, then how do we divide integers? Well, for division of integers, let's see. This one says I've got 9 positives. I'm going to divide them into 3 groups. Well, we end up with a positive 3. So a positive and a positive still make a positive. What about a negative and a positive? Well, if I got 9 negatives and I divide them into 3 groups, I'm going to end up with 3 negatives in each group. So a negative and a positive make a negative. Well, what if I have 9 things, but I need the opposite of what's in each group? So I still get a negative 3. So a positive and a negative make a negative. And what if I have 9 negatives, but I need to divide them into the opposite of what they are? We end up with a positive 3. So a negative and a negative make a positive. So if you see that, if you notice what's going on, positive, 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 negative, or negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, 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 positive, it's the same chart. So in division, we have the same rules. Step number 1, divide. Step number 2, count your negatives. So let's do a couple questions real quick. What if I gave you negative 25 divided by 5? Well, if I divide that, I end up with 5. How many negatives do you see? 1 negative. So my answer is negative. 45 divided by negative 9. Well, that's 5. 1 negative makes it negative. Negative 36 divided by negative 4. Well, 36 divided by 4 gives you 9. Negative and negative make a positive. Now, on the 4th question, you got to be real careful because this first part's an addition, but it's in parentheses, so we have to do it first. So we got to think back to our add rules. Well, at 26 plus negative 4, it is plus, so my signs are different, so that means I subtract. I get 22, and so it's 22 divided by negative 11. So 22 divided by 11 gives us 2. 1 negative makes it negative. And negative 54 divided by 6 gives us negative 9. So we've got 2 basic rules for multiply and divide. Okay, this is the multiply, divide is the same exact thing. Step number 1, multiply or divide your numbers. Step number 2, count your negative signs. If you have an even number of negative signs, your answer is positive. If you have an odd number, your answer is negative. And that's how you multiply or divide integers. Until next time.